Hey, welcome World Entertainment, and it's that time of year again where we're hearing about Star Trek movies. That's right, movies, not the TV shows, but the movies. But the indication now should be a bad sign for Alex Kurtzman because Paramount have now announced that Star Trek is going to be a major plan for them moving forward on the big screen. However, it won't be with Chris Pine, Zachary Quinto, or the J.J. Abrams universe. They want a fresh start. And Paramount themselves said this. Now, there's a massive article over on Variety where they're talking with David Ellison and stuff. It's not really about all the projects that they're doing, although they do announce kind of projects in there. It's more about the acquisition of Paramount and the idea of competing against Netflix and possibly what will happen with Warner Brothers and stuff like that. But they do mention Star Trek. And out of all the things, they said this, which you can see. The hope is to have a fresh Star Trek movie, though the studio has moved on from the idea of bringing back Chris Pine, Zachary Quinto, and the rest of the ensemble from the J.J. Abrams reboot. Now, that's very interesting to hear that. So, we're seeing different articles here saying like Paramount isn't bringing back Chris Pine, Zachary Quinto, or the rest of the crew from the J.J. Abrams Star Trek reboot. Variety reports that the studio wants a fresh Star Trek movie and has moved on from the Calvin cast. That means no Pine, Quinto, Urban Bridge reunion and no continuation of the 09 universe. This comes as Paramount is in transition and making franchise decisions tied to its future ownership, as leadership wants recognizable IP with a clear strategy. Star Trek is part of that plan, but the reboot crew appears done. And of course, don't forget, this comes on the heels of a few years ago when Abrams even announced a fourth installment with the original cast. Original, of course, being the reboot cast. And that was prompted many of them to confirm that the news came as a surprise to them and that they weren't even signed up for another one. Which that one was hilarious because that's when J.J. Abrams turned around and said, oh yeah, not just are we doing a new Star Trek movie with the original cast and stuff, but we're going to film it this coming spring or fall or something, he said. And that took everyone by surprise. And then, of course, I think Zachary Quinto was the first in an interview to promote something and got asked. And he was like, that's the first I've ever heard of it. And then, of course, Chris Pine got asked. And he was like, I'm not signed up to any new Star Trek. I don't know what he's talking about. So it was this case of nobody had been asked. No discussions were had with any cast. No contracts were signed. Nothing. But J.J. Abrams was out there not just saying is another one happening, but it was going to film that particular year that he said that. And of course, we had the Tarantino's movie that fell apart to come true because Tarantino decided at the last minute, wait a minute, do I really want my last movie to be a Star Trek movie? And of course, that was meant to be R-rated and all that crap. And we've heard Simon Pegg now come out and say, yeah, the idea for that movie was back crap crazy. And to hear Simon Pegg talk about it, it did seem to lean more into the direction that they were going to use the Calvin timeline cast, which of course was going to feature time travel. And that's a massive issue that this particular Star Trek kept doing, was time travel. Because that was the original idea for their Star Trek 4, was more time travel. That Chris Pine's Captain Kirk was going to meet Chris Hemsworth's George Kirk. And it was like, wait, so you're doing time travel again? And that was one of the reasons Paramount pulled the plug on it. They were like, we're not doing time travel again. You've literally just done time travel. Why would we do it again? And it was this idea that they just couldn't get past this idea of, but we want Chris Hemsworth back because look how successful he is now as Thor. And the studio, of course, wouldn't pay them. That was one of the biggest issues. Was Chris Pine was told, by the way, your contract that we signed with you to give you X amount of money. Yeah, we want to backtrack on that. We don't want to give you that money. Is there any chance you could take a pay cut? And he was like, no, I signed the contract. You signed the contract. Therefore, honor the contract. And they were like, yeah, we don't want to do that. And they did the same thing with Chris Hemsworth. They were saying like, we know you were offered this much, but is there any chance you could take a significant pay cut to come back? And he was like, no. So the one thing that should be noted about that situation was that was the newer people who came in. So the group that were in charge of Paramount at the time of those contracts being signed were gone, and Paramount was taken over by a new group, and they were the ones reneging on the contracts. So it's funny because it's saying here, the last we heard, the studio reportedly still intended to make the final chapter of the Chris Pine-led era of Star Trek movies, with Steve Yorkie, I think it's Yorkie, of the flight attendant, attached to write a new draft of that screenplay. Well, something has changed, and that's the studio's leadership, which of course is the big thing here. So then that kind of talks about the David Ellison interview, which was about his first 100 days in charge of Paramount and stuff, where he also says two other things that are a priority for them right now are Top Gun 3 and Days of Thunder 2. So they're pushing ahead with them as well. So what is actually going to happen, and why is this bad news for Kurtzman? Well, it's bad news for Kurtzman because if they're going in the direction of they want a fresh start on the big screen, what does that mean for the small screen? Now, Star Trek has the issue of it's not really a big screen adventure. It is something that should be made for TV. And the reason the movies did so well is because we knew the characters. We were with the characters. We were with the OG characters for 3 seasons before we got the movies. We were with the TNG cast for 7 seasons before we got the movies. So they were well-established characters and well-liked and loved. Dropping a brand new bunch of people into a movie on a brand new ship, you would assume, and stuff like that, you're running the risk of, if it doesn't work, then you're done. You know, you're not going to push through with another movie. Whereas you get the benefit with a series of, you know, your first 4 episodes are on rocky ground, but people start taking to it after that, you know. You don't have that luxury with the movie. And of course, the problem then is, what way do you do the budgets with these movies? Because Star Trek should not be $100 million budget movie. It should be down in the 50s, between 50 and 80. That's the golden side for what the budget should be for Star Trek. And that is one of the things even Simon Pegg spoke about, was one of the issues they were running into is each movie was getting more expensive to produce, and they really need to get away from that. And if you've ever been to, and I highly recommend you go to one if it's available to you, to the Rafa Khan screenings with Bill Shatner, because he spoke about that, at least at the one I was at, he spoke about it, where the motion picture they made for over 100 million. I think he said 120 million at the time, which was massive back in the 70s. Like, that was unheard of. And of course the movie was on rocky ground, and you know, it performed well, but not as well as they hoped. And one of the issues, of course, as well was Myers wasn't a Star Trek fan, and they needed to get someone who knew Star Trek in, or at least would have looked at Star Trek and kind of understood what it was. And what did they do? They went and did Wrath of Khan, but they made that for 70 million. Or what the equivalent would be of 70 million nowadays, I think. So you really got to bring the budgets down, and you got to write it like the TV shows. But if they're going for that fresh start and they're getting rid of JJ, well, that means they would possibly be looking for a fresh start on the small screen. And could the possibility be that they want a fresh start with a movie that then that movie's crew will go into a TV series? That's very possible. And if that is the case, then that would have to be the end of Kurtzman. Because we know Kurtzman won't have anything to do with the movie because that's already been established. Apparently Kurtzman wanted to try and gain full control of the movies as well, and Ellison apparently flat out said that's not happening at all. So this looks very much like they're on course to let Kurtzman's contract lapse next year, not renew it, and just get rid of him and go for a brand new fresh start with Star Trek. And hopefully if they do that, and even with this movie, hopefully not just does it work, but hopefully they get people in who understand what Star Trek is and make it Star Trek. I don't want more of this BS of a new group comes in and goes, well, we need it to be Guardians of the Galaxy meets Game of Thrones, but on the Enterprise. It'd be like, no, piss off. We want it to be Star Trek, because that's the franchise we love. That's the franchise we're coming to see. We don't need it to be something completely different. It doesn't need to be Star Wars. It doesn't need to be Guardians of the Galaxy. It doesn't need to be Game of Thrones or any of this crap. It needs to be Star Trek. And I don't understand why they can't understand that. You look at what Kurtzman's doing on the TV, it's basically like Star Wars. They're trying to make Star Wars for TV just with this brand name of Star Trek. It's not Star Trek at all what they're making. And of course, they're out there already saying, oh, don't worry, Season 5 of Strange New Worlds will be true Star Trek, like the Star Trek you knew and loved. It's like, wow, really? 8 years into you running this crap and now you're still saying the same thing you said after the first year? Yeah, I'm gonna press X to doubt. So we'll have to wait and see exactly where this movie goes. Obviously, the big question now will be who's gonna end up writing it, who's gonna produce it, who's gonna direct it, and what kind of cast is it gonna be, and what time period is it gonna be. You know, they're saying a fresh start, but they haven't flat out said not in the Calvin timeline. They just said that that crew and JJ won't be back. But it sounds like they're going to go with something completely different that's not connected to any of that. So we'll wait and see. It's going to be interesting if it even happens. So what do you guys think? Do you think this is the end of Kurtzman Trek with this announcement? Are you excited about this idea of a new fresh take on Star Trek on the big screen? Do you have confidence in David Ellison and Paramount and Skydance to do right? Let me know. And with that, I shall leave it there for this one. So do like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. Hit the hype button. Check out memberships. You know the drill. Cheers, and I'll catch you in the next one.